Welcome to today's episode, where we uncover one of history's most extraordinary military phenomena. Picture this: August 1810, Vienna. The same palace where Habsburg emperors once held court now trembles at the mention of one name, Napoleon Bonaparte. A man who just 20 years earlier was an unknown artillery officer from a backwater Mediterranean island now commands an empire stretching from Spain to Poland, from Amsterdam to Rome. How does this happen? How does one man conquer kingdoms that have stood for centuries? By 1810, Napoleon directly controls over 44 million Europeans, nearly half the continent's population. He has defeated Austria 5 times, Prussia twice, and Russia once. The Holy Roman Empire, which lasted 1,000 years, crumbles at his feet. But Napoleon didn't just conquer through brute force. He revolutionized warfare itself. While his enemies marched in rigid lines like their grandfathers, Napoleon moved with lightning speed, struck with mathematical precision, and adapted faster than anyone thought possible. Tonight, we decode the secrets behind history's most successful military campaign. We'll witness the battles that redefined combat, explore the mind of a strategic genius, and uncover how a Corsican nobody became Europe's master. Was it revolutionary tactics? Political brilliance? Sheer audacity? The answer lies in a perfect storm of innovation, opportunity, and relentless ambition to change the world forever. How did Napoleon Bonaparte conquer almost half the world? Let's find out. The making of a conqueror. The year is 1785. In the Royal Military Academy of Paris, 16-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte sits alone in the library, his fellow cadets' laughter echoing from the courtyard. They mock his thick Corsican accent, calling him straw-nose for how he pronounces French words. These aristocratic sons treat him like the provincial outsider he is, a scholarship boy from France's newest, most rebellious territory. While they play cards and discuss their inherited estates, Napoleon devours every military text he can find. Caesar's campaigns, Alexander's tactics, Frederick the Great's victories. He absorbs them all with obsessive intensity. His notebooks fill with diagrams of ancient battles, calculations of supply lines, theories about artillery placement. His instructors notice something unusual about this awkward teenager. Where other students memorize by rote, Bonaparte thinks strategically. He doesn't just learn what happened. He questions why it happened, how it could have been done better, what he would have done differently. None of his classmates suspect that this lonely, intense young man will someday make them kneel before him as emperor. But the seeds of greatness are already there, planted in isolation and watered by burning ambition. In just 11 years, this provincial nobody will announce his genius to the world. Napoleon's transformation from outsider to conqueror begins with a stroke of historical luck. Born in 1769 in Corsica, he arrives just 1 year after France annexes the island from Genoa. His father, Charles Bonaparte, quickly adapts to French rule, securing scholarships for his sons in French schools. This twist of fate catapults young Napoleon into the rigid world of France as military elite, a world that will both shape and reject him. At the military school of Brienne, Napoleon encounters the Ancien Regime's officer class. These are men who purchase their commissions, who view warfare as a gentleman's pursuit, who believe birth matters more than ability. They follow outdated tactics from textbooks written 50 years earlier. To them, war is a slow, methodical affair of sieges and formal battles, conducted like an elaborate dance between aristocratic opponents. But the teenage Napoleon sees warfare differently. He studies mathematics obsessively, understanding that artillery, his chosen specialty, requires precise calculations of trajectory, powder charges, and timing. While his peers learn to fence and dance, he maps battle formations and calculates supply requirements. He's not preparing to be a gentleman officer. He's preparing to be a military scientist. The French Revolution changes everything. Suddenly, The aristocratic officers Napoleon once envied are fleeing France or meeting the guillotine. The rigid hierarchy that kept him at the bottom collapses overnight. Merit begins to matter more than birth. Revolutionary fervor demands new kinds of leaders, men who can inspire citizen soldiers rather than command purchased loyalty. Young Lieutenant Bonaparte seizes this moment. In 1793, during the siege of Toulon, he demonstrates his artillery expertise by positioning cannons to devastating effect against British and Spanish forces occupying the port. His precise calculations and innovative tactics help recapture the city. At age 24, he becomes the youngest general in French history. This victory reveals Napoleon's emerging tactical philosophy. While traditional generals view artillery as support for infantry, Napoleon sees cannons as concentrated striking power. He masses his guns at decisive points, creating overwhelming firepower that shatters enemy lines. This concentration of force becomes his signature, not spreading resources evenly, but overwhelming the enemy at critical moments. But Napoleon's genius extends beyond tactics to psychology. He understands that the revolution has unleashed something unprecedented in European warfare: ideological passion. His soldiers don't fight merely for pay or glory. They fight for liberty, equality, and the promise of advancement based on merit. Napoleon cultivates this revolutionary spirit while imposing rigid discipline and professional training. He also grasps the power of propaganda. After each victory, he writes dramatic dispatches that transform military actions into epic narratives. He presents himself not as a mercenary commander, but as the embodiment of revolutionary ideals, the little corporal who rose through merit alone. Common soldiers see him as proof that they too can achieve greatness. During these early years, Napoleon develops the administrative skills that will later govern an empire. He doesn't just win battles. He organizes supply lines, coordinates with civilian authorities, and manages complex logistics. He learns to move armies faster than anyone thought possible by streamlining equipment, improving roads, and creating mobile supply systems. His voracious reading continues. He studies not just military history, but politics, economics, and law. He corresponds with intellectuals, absorbs Enlightenment philosophy, and develops theories about governance. This broad education distinguishes him from typical military commanders. He thinks strategically about entire nations, not just battlefields. By 1795, Napoleon has suppressed royalist uprisings in Paris with his famous whiff of grapeshot, demonstrating his willingness to use force against political enemies. The Directory recognizes his value, but also fears his ambition. They need his military genius, but worry about his growing popularity. Napoleon, meanwhile, chafes under political restrictions. He has tasted command and found it intoxicating. His mind races with possibilities, new campaigns, revolutionary tactics, the chance to prove his theories on a larger stage. He studies maps of Italy obsessively, seeing opportunity where others see risk. The stage is set for his breakthrough. The awkward teenager who once sat alone in the academy library has become a formidable general with radical ideas about warfare. He has weapons his enemies lack: speed, concentration, merit-based leadership, and revolutionary fervor. Most importantly, he has absolute confidence in his own abilities. In 1796, the Directory will give him independent command of the Army of Italy. They expect him to distract Austria while the main French armies attack along the Rhine. Instead, Napoleon will use this assignment to announce his genius to Europe. The provincial nobody is about to become a conqueror. The transformation is complete. The lonely student who memorized ancient battles has become a living embodiment of military revolution. Everything he learned, everything he endured, everything he dreamed has prepared him for this moment. Napoleon Bonaparte is ready to conquer the world. Italian lightning, March 1796. The raggedy army of Italy stands before its new commander, a gaunt, 26-year-old general who looks more like a scarecrow than a conqueror. Napoleon Bonaparte's uniform hangs loose on his skeletal frame. His long hair falls unkempt around his shoulders, and his piercing gray eyes burn with an intensity that makes hardened veterans uncomfortable. Some soldiers snicker behind his back. "The Directory sent us a boy," they whisper. They have no idea they're looking at the future master of Europe. The army Napoleon inherits is a disaster. Soldiers wear rags instead of uniforms, march barefoot through alpine snow, and survive on scraps of stale bread. They haven't been paid in months. Desertion rates soar. Equipment is so scarce that cannons lack proper wheels, forcing artillery crews to drag guns behind oxen. Morale has collapsed so completely that officers openly discuss surrender. But Napoleon sees something his predecessors missed: potential. These aren't pampered aristocrats playing at war. These are revolutionary soldiers, men who rose from nothing and fight for everything. They need leadership, not luxury. They crave victory, not comfort. Within hours of taking command, Napoleon transforms despair into desperate hope. "Soldiers," he declares, standing atop an ammunition wagon so every man can see him, "you are naked and ill-fed. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities will be in your power." His voice carries across the camp like electricity. "I will lead you where no Roman army has ever marched. You will win battles and capture standards. You will win honor, glory, and riches." This isn't just propaganda. It's Napoleon's revolutionary understanding of motivation. Traditional generals command through fear and rigid discipline. Napoleon leads through inspiration and shared ambition. He doesn't promise safety. He promises greatness. He doesn't offer comfort. He offers glory. His soldiers begin to believe that following this strange young general might actually lead somewhere magnificent. Within days, Napoleon demonstrates why the Directory chose him. While Austrian and Piedmontese forces expect slow, methodical warfare, Napoleon moves with shocking speed. His armies don't march, they race. He abandons heavy supply trains that slow traditional forces, teaching his men to live off the land. "I may lose a battle, but I shall never lose a minute," becomes his motto. The enemy coalition faces a fundamental problem. Their armies are spread across multiple fronts, connected by slow communication and conflicting objectives. Austria wants to protect northern Italy. Piedmont wants to defend its homeland. Neither fully trusts the other. Napoleon recognizes this weakness immediately and exploits it with ruthless efficiency. On April 12, 1796, at Montenotte, Napoleon launches his first independent battle as a general. He demonstrates the tactical philosophy that will dominate Europe for 20 years. Concentrate superior force at the decisive point. While enemies spread their armies to defend everything, Napoleon masses his troops to attack one thing and destroy it completely. The battle unfolds like a mathematical equation. Austrian General Beaulieu deploys his forces in a defensive arc, expecting Napoleon to attack the center. Instead, Napoleon feints toward the Austrian left while secretly massing his main force against their isolated right wing at Montenotte. When his concentrated artillery opens fire, Austrian resistance crumbles within hours. "I fought them in detail," Napoleon explains to his staff after the victory. This phrase becomes his signature strategy, defeating larger enemies by fighting them piecemeal, one fragment at a time, before they can unite their strength. It's warfare as geometry, angles, positioning, and calculated strikes. The victory at Montenotte shatters Austrian confidence and electrifies French morale. Suddenly, Napoleon's promises don't sound like fantasy. His soldiers begin to walk taller, march faster, fight harder. The transformation is psychological as much as tactical. They start believing they're invincible because their general acts like he as invincible. 4 days later, at Malissimo, Napoleon strikes again. This time, he targets the Piedmontese, using speed and surprise to isolate them from Austrian support. His troops cover impossible distances, 50 miles in 2 days over mountain roads, appearing where enemies least expect them. Piedmontese generals, trained in leisurely 18th century warfare, cannot adapt to Napoleon's frantic pace. The Piedmontese collapse. King Victor Amadeus III, realizing his army faces annihilation, desperately seeks peace. On April 28th, he signs the Armistice of Carrasco, withdrawing Piedmont from the coalition and opening Alpine passes to French forces. In just 3 weeks, Napoleon has eliminated one enemy completely and isolated the other. But Napoleon's genius extends beyond battlefield tactics to strategic vision. While his enemies think about individual battles, he thinks about entire campaigns. While they focus on territory, he focuses on enemy armies. "I am not concerned with the conquest of cities," he writes to the Directory, "but with the destruction of enemy forces." Capture ground, he realizes, and enemies can retake it. Destroy their armies, and they cannot fight at all. The Austrian response reveals everything wrong with 18th century military thinking. General Beaulieu, stunned by his defeats, retreats toward the fortress of Mantua, hoping to regroup behind strong walls. This is exactly what Napoleon wants, an enemy that thinks defensively while he thinks offensively. At Lodi, on May 10th, Napoleon faces his first major river crossing under fire. Austrian artillery dominates the bridge, making any advance seem suicidal. Traditional generals would spend weeks constructing elaborate siege works. Napoleon sees opportunity where others see obstacles. He personally sights the French cannons, calculating angles and distances with mathematical precision. "Watch this," he tells his gunners, then demonstrates the trajectory needed to silence Austrian batteries. His artillery barrage is so accurate that Austrian resistance collapses within an hour. French infantry storms across the bridge under Napoleon's personal leadership. This moment transforms Napoleon from general to legend. His soldiers, witnessing their commander personally aiming cannons under enemy fire, begin calling him Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. The nickname sticks because it captures something essential about Napoleon's leadership. He doesn't just command from headquarters, he leads from the front. The psychological impact of Lodi resonates far beyond the battlefield. Austrian forces, believing themselves superior to revolutionary rabble, suddenly realize they face something unprecedented. A French army that moves faster, strikes harder, and fights more intelligently than anything they've encountered. Fear begins to replace confidence in Austrian councils of war. Napoleon recognizes that speed creates its own momentum. While Austrian generals write lengthy reports and wait for permission from Vienna, he strikes repeatedly without pause. At Bolgetto, he surprises an Austrian rearguard. At Peschiera, he captures an entire fortress through audacious assault. Each victory makes the next one easier because enemies expect defeat before battles even begin. The strategic situation transforms completely. Austrian forces, scattered across northern Italy, cannot concentrate quickly enough to match Napoleon's movements. He defeats them in detail. Beaulieu at Fombio, Liptay at Kadokmel, Sebastendorf at Seva, turning warfare into a series of mathematical problems solved through superior positioning and timing. By June 1796, Napoleon controls most of northern Italy. Austrian forces retreat behind the walls of Mantua, hoping fortifications can accomplish what field armies could not. But Napoleon has no intention of conducting a traditional siege. Instead, he transforms Mantua into a trap, using the fortress to lure Austrian relief armies to their destruction. The campaign's success exceeds every prediction. The Directory expected Napoleon to conduct a limited diversion while main French armies attacked Germany. Instead, he has transformed the secondary theater into the war's decisive front. His bulletins read aloud in Paris cafes, make him France's most famous general. The awkward provincial has become a national hero. Napoleon's Italian campaign establishes the template for all his future conquests. Rapid concentration, decisive battle, psychological dominance, and strategic exploitation. He doesn't just defeat enemies, he destroys their will to resist. He doesn't just capture territory, he reshapes the political landscape. The boy general has announced his genius to Europe. Kings tremble at his name, generals study his tactics, and soldiers dream of serving under his command. The Corsican nobody has become the master of Italy. But this is just the beginning. Napoleon's ambitions stretch far beyond Alpine valleys toward horizons that will soon encompass half the world. The Egyptian Gambit. May 19, 1798. The Mediterranean stretches endlessly before the largest French fleet assembled since the days of Louis XIV. 400 ships carry 38,000 soldiers, 2,000 cannons, and one obsessed general toward a destination so secret that even his officers don't know their target. Napoleon Bonaparte, now 28 and drunk on Italian victories, has convinced the Directory to gamble France as future on the most audacious military expedition since Alexander the Great marched toward India. Soldiers, Napoleon addresses his troops as French ships disappear over the horizon. You are undertaking a conquest whose effects on civilization and world commerce are incalculable. You will strike the most decisive blow against England, until you can deal her the death blow itself. His words carry across packed transport vessels like thunder. This isn't just another campaign. It's Napoleon's bid to reshape global power forever. The Egyptian expedition reveals Napoleon's genius for grand strategy. While his enemies expect him to attack Austria or invade England directly, he strikes at Britain's lifeline to India. Egypt controls the shortest route to Britain's most valuable possession. Cut this connection, Napoleon calculates, and British commerce collapses. India becomes vulnerable. The entire balance of global power shifts toward France. But Napoleon's motives extend beyond military strategy into pure megalomaniac ambition. He sees himself as the heir to Alexander the Great, Caesar, and all history's legendary conquerors. Egypt offers the chance to acquire Eastern mystique, to become not just a French general, but a world historical figure. He brings 167 scholars, scientists, and artists alongside his soldiers, planning to conquer minds as well as territory. The expedition faces immediate disaster. Admiral Nelson's British fleet hunts Napoleon's ships across the Mediterranean like wolves pursuing sheep. French vessels, overloaded with men and equipment, can barely outrun their pursuers. Napoleon's gamble depends entirely on reaching Egypt before the British Navy destroys his expedition at sea. Fortune favors the audacious. On July 1st, French ships sight Alexandria just hours before Nelson's squadron appears on the horizon. Napoleon orders immediate landing, knowing that delay means annihilation. His soldiers wade ashore through surf while British sails grow larger behind them. The race against time has begun, and Napoleon has won the first round. Alexandria falls within hours. Egyptian resistance, organized around medieval tactics and obsolete weapons, crumbles against European military science. French artillery, positioned with mathematical precision, reduces ancient walls to rubble. Napoleon's soldiers swarm through breaches with revolutionary fervor, carrying tricolored banners into mosques that have stood for centuries. But capturing Alexandria proves easier than conquering Egypt. The desert stretches endlessly inland, offering no supplies, no shelter, and no respite from crushing heat. Napoleon's army, trained in European warfare, faces an environment more hostile than any enemy. Soldiers accustomed to alpine streams find only salt water and sand. Men who marched through Italian vineyards now stumble across endless dunes under merciless sun. The march to Cairo becomes an ordeal that tests every aspect of Napoleon's leadership. Traditional generals would have retreated to Alexandria's safety, waiting for reinforcements and supplies. Napoleon drives forward with characteristic audacity, understanding that hesitation in Egypt means death. His soldiers must conquer or perish. There is no middle ground. Remember, Napoleon tells his staff as they cross the desert, "From these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." He transforms military necessity into historical destiny, making his soldiers feel like participants in an epic that will echo through eternity. This isn't just conquest. It's Napoleon's genius for making ordinary men feel extraordinary. July 21st, 1798. The Battle of the Pyramids unfolds like a clash between different ages. Mameluke cavalry, magnificent in silk robes and gleaming scimitars, charge Napoleon's infantry squares with medieval courage and obsolete tactics. They fight like knights from the Crusades, individually brave, collectively doomed. Napoleon arranges his forces in mathematical precision. 5 infantry squares, each containing cannons and muskets, create interlocking fields of fire that no cavalry charge can penetrate. When the Mamelukes attack, they ride into carefully calculated killing zones. European military science meets Eastern warfare and obliterates it. The battle lasts 6 hours. When smoke clears, Mameluke power lies broken across Egyptian sand. Napoleon has shattered a military system that ruled Egypt for 5 centuries. His soldiers loot abandoned camps, discovering treasures that seem lifted from Arabian Nights, silks, jewels, gold, and ivory beyond European imagination. Cairo surrenders without resistance. Napoleon enters the ancient city like a conquering pharaoh, establishing himself in palaces once inhabited by sultans. He studies Islamic law, meets with scholars, and presents himself as Islam's protector rather than its enemy. "I respect God, His Prophet, and the Quran," he declares, understanding that successful conquest requires more than military victory. But Napoleon's Eastern dreams face brutal reality. On August 1st, Admiral Nelson finally catches the French fleet at anchor in Aboukir Bay. The Battle of the Nile unfolds as a maritime disaster that traps Napoleon's entire army in Egypt. British cannons reduce French ships to floating wreckage, eliminating any hope of reinforcement or retreat. News of the naval catastrophe reaches Napoleon while he's organizing Egyptian administration. His reaction reveals the steel beneath his romantic ambitions. Well, he tells his staff with characteristic sang-froid, "We must stay here or leave as great as the ancients." Trapped between desert and sea, Napoleon transforms disaster into opportunity. The destruction of his fleet actually liberates Napoleon from French political control. The Directory cannot interfere with his Egyptian policies when no ships can reach him. He rules Egypt as an independent sovereign, experimenting with governance on a scale impossible in France. This isolation allows Napoleon to develop the administrative skills that will later govern a European empire. Napoleon establishes French rule with typical efficiency. He creates new legal codes, modernizes taxation, improves irrigation, and promotes scientific research. The scholars he brought begin documenting Egyptian antiquities, launching the field of Egyptology. French engineers survey the Suez Canal route, envisioning the commercial revolution that will transform global trade decades later. But military realities intrude on Napoleon's civilizing mission. Ottoman Turkey, Egypt's nominal ruler, declares war on France. A Turkish army marched south from Syria while British ships blockade Egyptian ports. Napoleon faces enemies on multiple fronts with no hope of reinforcement. The conqueror has become the besieged. February 1799. Napoleon launches his Syrian campaign with vintage audacity. Rather than wait for Turkish attack, he strikes first, marching into the desert with 13,000 men. The expedition reveals both his strategic brilliance and growing megalomania. He captures Gaza, defeats Turkish forces at Mount Tabor, and lays siege to the fortress of Acre. Acre becomes Napoleon's first significant failure. The ancient fortress, strengthened by British naval support, resists every assault. Turkish defenders, advised by British officers, match French tactical skill with desperate courage. Napoleon's artillery, so effective in European battles, cannot breach walls constantly repaired under enemy fire. The siege drags on for 2 months. Disease ravages French ranks faster than Turkish bullets. Plague strikes Napoleon's army with medieval horror. Soldiers die by hundreds, their bodies burned in vast pyres that darken the Palestinian sky. Even Napoleon's iron constitution succumbs. He falls seriously ill, nearly dying in a tent outside walls he cannot capture. May 1799. Napoleon abandons the siege of Acre, retreating to Egypt with his reputation tarnished for the first time. The withdrawal marks a crucial turning point, the first crack in the legend of invincibility that carried him through Italy. His soldiers, witnessing their commander's fallibility, begin to doubt the myth of inevitable victory. But Napoleon demonstrates his genius for transforming defeat into propaganda triumph. His bulletins describe the Syrian campaign as a glorious victory, glossing over the failure at Acre while emphasizing victories at Gaza and Mount Tabor. French newspapers, unable to verify stories from distant Egypt, print his version without question. The legend survives despite reality. Meanwhile, European coalitions reform against French power. Austria, Russia, and Britain unite in the Second Coalition, launching simultaneous attacks on French positions across Europe. Italy, conquered so brilliantly in 1796, falls back under Austrian control. German territories revolt against French occupation. The Directory, weakened by military disasters and political chaos, teeters toward collapse. Napoleon recognizes that his Egyptian adventure has become a magnificent dead end. He has conquered Egypt, established efficient administration, and enhanced his legend through Eastern mystique. But real power lies in Europe, where his enemies carve up French conquests while he plays Pharaoh in the desert. August 1799. Napoleon makes the decision that defines his career. Abandoning his army to its fate, he escapes Egypt aboard a fast frigate, evading British patrols through luck and audacity. He abandons 30,000 soldiers to British captivity and Ottoman revenge, a betrayal that would destroy lesser commanders, but somehow enhances Napoleon's reputation for decisive action. The Egyptian expedition ends in strategic failure but psychological triumph. Napoleon has failed to destroy British power in the East, failed to hold his conquests, and failed to return with his army intact. But he returns to France as a legendary figure, a general who dared to follow Alexander's footsteps into the mysterious Orient. More importantly, Napoleon returns to political chaos that creates unprecedented opportunity. The Directory has proven incapable of governing France or winning the war. French citizens, exhausted by revolutionary turmoil and military disasters, crave strong leadership. The Egyptian adventure, despite its ultimate failure, has transformed Napoleon from successful general into messianic figure. The boy from Corsica has evolved into something far more dangerous than a mere military commander. He has become a legend, a man who seems touched by destiny itself. Soon he will discover that France, like Egypt, can be conquered by those audacious enough to seize the moment. Seizing power. October 9, 1799. Paris trembles with rumors as Napoleon Bonaparte's ship docks at Frejus after his escape from Egypt. News of his return spreads through the capital like wildfire, carried by breathless messengers who speak his name in hushed, reverent tones. In coffeehouses and salons, citizens whisper of the legendary general who conquered the pyramids and walked where pharaohs once ruled. They have no idea that this returning hero plans to conquer France itself. The Directory that Napoleon left behind has collapsed into chaos. 5 years of revolutionary government have produced nothing but military disasters, economic ruin, and political paralysis. French armies retreat across Europe as the Second Coalition reclaims territories won through so much blood. The treasury lies empty, inflation ravages the economy, and civil war threatens in western provinces. France, the nation that once terrified monarchical Europe, now teeters on the brink of complete collapse. But Napoleon sees opportunity where others see disaster. Political chaos creates the perfect environment for ambitious men willing to seize power through audacious action. The Directory's weakness becomes his strength, its failures his justification for what comes next. "I found the crown of France lying in the gutter," he will later claim, "and I picked it up with my sword." Within hours of his arrival in Paris, Napoleon begins weaving the conspiracy that will transform him from general to dictator. He meets secretly with Abbé, the political theorist seeking a sword to protect the Republic from its enemies. He courts his brother Lucien, now president of the Council of 500. Most crucially, he aligns with Talleyrand, the former bishop turned foreign minister whose political survival instincts rival Napoleon's military genius. Talleyrand recognizes what others miss. Napoleon possesses that rarest of political qualities, the ability to make ordinary people believe extraordinary things are possible. He has the luck of the devil, Talleyrand observes. And in politics, luck matters more than genius. The cynical diplomat decides to bet his career on the Corsican's rising star. The conspiracy accelerates with characteristic Napoleonic speed. While the Directory debates endlessly in committee, Napoleon acts with military decisiveness. He secures the loyalty of key regiments stationed around Paris. He cultivates relationships with influential journalists who can shape public opinion. Most importantly, he projects an image of inevitable success that makes neutrals want to join his cause. November 9th, 1799 to 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar. The day that will transform European history begins with careful theater. The conspirators convince the legislature that a Jacobin plot threatens the Republic, creating justification for emergency measures. Napoleon, appointed commander of Paris garrison, uses this authority to move loyal troops into position around government buildings. The first phase unfolds with clockwork precision. Both houses of the legislature, citing the fabricated emergency, vote to transfer their sessions to St. Cloud Palace outside Paris, ostensibly for security, actually to isolate them from potential popular support. Napoleon's soldiers escort the deputies like shepherds guiding sheep to slaughter. But the second phase nearly destroys everything. At St. Cloud, the Council of 500 recognizes the coup attempt and explodes in outrage. Deputies surround Napoleon as he enters their chamber, grabbing his uniform, shaking their fists, screaming, "Down with the dictator! Outlaw him!" For a terrifying moment, the future emperor of Europe stands helpless before an angry mob of politicians. Napoleon's famous composure cracks completely. His face turns pale, his hands shake, his voice fails him. This man, who commanded armies with absolute confidence, cannot handle a room full of shouting civilians. He staggers from the chamber in near panic, his legend of invincibility suddenly seeming fragile as glass. Outside, his brother Lucien saves the coup through brilliant improvisation. Standing before Napoleon's grenadiers, he waves a sword dramatically and declares, "I swear I will stab my own brother through the heart if he ever attempts anything against liberty." This theatrical gesture, suggesting that Napoleon acts to protect rather than destroy the Republic, transforms the soldiers' uncertainty into enthusiastic support. The grenadiers march into the chamber with fixed bayonets. Deputies flee through windows and doors in undignified panic, leaving behind only their abandoned speeches and overturned furniture. The Council of 500, which has governed France for 4 years, dissolves in 15 minutes of military pressure. The Directory dies not with revolutionary violence, but with farcical collapse. By evening, a rump legislature of carefully selected deputies votes to establish a new government, the Consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. The title sounds republican and temporary, but everyone understands the reality. France now belongs to the 30-year-old general who conquered Italy and Egypt. The revolution, begun with dreams of liberty and equality, has produced its own Caesar. Napoleon moves immediately to consolidate power with the same systematic approach he applies to military campaigns. He purges the administration, replacing directory appointees with his own supporters. He controls the press through a combination of censorship and bribery, ensuring that newspapers print only favorable coverage. He establishes a secret police force under Joseph Fouché, creating an intelligence network that monitors potential enemies across France. But Napoleon understands that lasting power requires more than force. It demands popular consent. He launches a series of domestic reforms designed to heal France's revolutionary wounds and restore national confidence. The Concordat with Pope Pius VII reconciles the Catholic Church with the revolutionary state, ending a decade of religious civil war. French citizens, exhausted by atheistic extremism, welcome the return of traditional faith. The Code Napoleon represents his most lasting domestic achievement. This comprehensive legal system, based on Roman law and Enlightenment principles, replaces the chaotic patchwork of local customs that govern pre-revolutionary France. For the first time, all French citizens live under uniform laws that guarantee property rights, legal equality, and individual liberty, revolutionary concepts embedded in practical legislation. Napoleon's administrative reforms transform French government from revolutionary chaos into efficient bureaucracy. He creates the modern prefectural system, appointing loyal administrators to govern each department. He establishes competitive examinations for civil service, ensuring that government positions go to capable men rather than political favorites. He builds roads, canals, and public works that stimulate economic recovery. Education receives special attention as Napoleon recognizes its importance for national power. He creates a centralized school system designed to produce competent administrators, skilled technicians, and loyal citizens. "My object is to be able to cast a certain mold," he explains, "and all men in France at the same time shall be doing the same thing." This educational uniformity helps forge French national identity from regional diversity. Military reorganization proceeds simultaneously with domestic reform. Napoleon transforms the Revolutionary Army from an enthusiastic mob into Europe's most professional fighting force. He establishes military schools to train officers, creates the Legion of Honor to reward merit, and develops the Grande Armée's distinctive tactical systems. Every reform serves dual purposes, strengthening France and consolidating his personal power. The first consul cultivates his public image with unprecedented sophistication. Official portraits show him as a Roman emperor, hand tucked inside his coat in classical pose. Propaganda presents him as France's savior, the man of destiny who ended revolutionary chaos and restored national greatness. Jacques-Louis David's paintings transformed the Corsican artillery officer into a mythic hero worthy of ancient legends. But Napoleon's ultimate genius lies in his ability to embody contradictory ideals simultaneously. To former aristocrats, he represents order and stability after revolutionary terror. To common soldiers, he remains the little corporal who rose through merit. To intellectuals, he champions Enlightenment rationalism. To peasants, he protects property and religion. Everyone sees what they want to see in this protean figure. By 1802, Napoleon's domestic success enables foreign policy triumphs. The Treaty of Amiens brings temporary peace with Britain, while victories in Italy secure French dominance over continental Europe. The consulate, originally conceived as emergency government, appears so successful that few question its permanence. Napoleon has transformed military conquest into political legitimacy. The plebiscite of 1802 confirms Napoleon's position as consul for life, granting him powers that differ from monarchy only in name. French citizens, grateful for peace and prosperity after a decade of chaos, overwhelmingly endorse his rule. The vote represents more than political calculation. It reflects genuine popular enthusiasm for the man who has restored France's greatness. 2 years later, another plebiscite approves Napoleon's transformation into Emperor of the French. The ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, with Pope Pius VII in attendance, symbolically links the new regime to both revolutionary legitimacy and traditional authority. When Napoleon crowns himself rather than accepting the crown from papal hands, he demonstrates that his power derives from personal achievement rather than divine right or democratic election. The awkward teenager who once endured aristocratic mockery has become Europe's most powerful ruler. The provincial outsider who studied military history in lonely academy libraries now commands armies that will reshape the continent. The coup of 18 Brumaire has evolved into the Napoleonic Empire, and the former artillery officer stands poised to conquer half the world. The Grande Armée. August 1805. From the cliffs of Boulogne, Napoleon Bonaparte gazes across the English Channel toward the white shores of his greatest enemy. Behind him stretches the largest military encampment Europe has ever seen. 200,000 men organized into the most formidable fighting force in human history. The Grande Armée, forged from revolutionary enthusiasm and imperial discipline, represents the culmination of Napoleon's military genius. Soon these soldiers will abandon their invasion preparations to march across Europe in campaigns that will echo through eternity. The Grande Armée emerges from Napoleon's revolutionary understanding of warfare itself. Traditional 18th century armies fight like mechanical toys, rigid, predictable, and slow. Soldiers march in perfect lines, commanders follow established rules, and battles unfold according to textbook principles that haven't changed since Louis XIV's reign. Napoleon shatters this entire system, replacing clockwork precision with lightning speed, mathematical calculations with intuitive brilliance. At the heart of Napoleon's revolution lies the corps system, his most significant military innovation. Instead of commanding a single massive army, Napoleon divides his forces into independent corps of 20,000 to 30,000 men each. Every corps contains infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineers, a complete army in miniature capable of fighting alone if necessary. This organization allows unprecedented flexibility. Corps can move separately to confuse enemies, then concentrate rapidly for decisive battles. Marshal Louis-Alexandre Berthier, Napoleon's chief of staff, transforms these theoretical concepts into practical reality. His staff system coordinates the movement of multiple corps with clockwork precision, ensuring that scattered forces can unite at precisely the right time and place. Berthier's maps, marked with colored pens showing each unit's position, become the nervous system of Napoleonic warfare. "I may lose a battle," Napoleon often says, "but I shall never lose a minute." The Grande Armée moves faster than any force in military history. While enemies lumber along at traditional speeds of 10 miles per day, Napoleon's corps cover 20, 30, sometimes even 40 miles in a single march. This velocity comes from revolutionary changes in military logistics. Instead of dragging massive supply trains, French soldiers carry 3 days' rations and forage for additional food. They travel light, strike hard, and disappear before enemies can respond. Napoleon's soldiers embody the meritocratic ideals of revolutionary France. Every private carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack, not literally, but philosophically. Promotion depends on ability rather than birth, courage rather than connections. Sergeants become generals, corporals become marshals, and common soldiers dream of glory that previous ages reserved for aristocrats alone. This social revolution creates unprecedented military motivation. The officer corps reflects this transformation completely. Marshal Joachim Murat, Napoleon's greatest cavalry commander, began as the son of an innkeeper. Marshal Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, started as a barrel cooper's apprentice. Marshal Jan Lannes rose from blacksmith to duke through battlefield courage alone. These men fight with desperate intensity because they understand that failure means returning to obscurity while success offers immortal fame. But the Grande Armée represents more than social mobility. It embodies revolutionary ideology transformed into military power. French soldiers fight not just for pay or plunder, but for the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They carry revolutionary fervor to monarchical Europe, spreading French ideals at gunpoint across the continent. This ideological component makes Napoleon's forces more than conquerors. They become missionaries of a new political order. Artillery receives special emphasis in Napoleon's system, reflecting his background as an artillery officer who understands the decisive power of concentrated firepower. He masses cannons at crucial points, creating grand batteries of 60-80, sometimes over 100 guns that can shatter any defense. God fights on the side with the best artillery, Napoleon declares, and he ensures that side is always France. The Imperial Guard represents the Grande Armée's elite corps, veterans selected for exceptional courage, loyalty, and military skill. These grognards, grumblers, march in bearskin caps and blue uniforms that mark them as Napoleon's chosen soldiers. He uses the guard sparingly, holding them in reserve until decisive moments when their intervention can transform stalemate into victory. Enemies learn to fear the cry, "La garde au feu," the guard to the fire. Cavalry organization reaches unprecedented sophistication under Napoleon's direction. Heavy cavalry, cuirassiers in gleaming breastplates, smash through enemy lines with thunderous charges. Light cavalry, hussars and chasseurs, scout ahead of the army, gather intelligence, and pursue broken enemies. Dragoons combine the mobility of cavalry with the firepower of infantry, dismounting to fight on foot when terrain demands. This combined arms approach maximizes each weapon's strengths while minimizing weaknesses. Napoleon's personal leadership style binds the Grande Armée together through emotional bonds that transcend mere military discipline. He knows thousands of his soldiers by name, remembers their battle records, and inquires about their families. Veterans speak in hushed tones about moments when the emperor himself pinned decorations on their chests or asked about wounds received in his service. This personal connection creates fanatical loyalty that no amount of gold could purchase. The legend of Napoleonic invincibility becomes a weapon more powerful than cannons or bayonets. Enemy soldiers, hearing that they face the Grande Armée, often lose battles before fighting begins. The psychological impact of Napoleon's presence on battlefields allegedly equals 40,000 additional troops. Opposing generals, knowing they face the master of European warfare, make defensive decisions that hand initiative to French forces. Training emphasizes speed, flexibility, and individual initiative rather than mechanical precision. French soldiers learn to think as well as obey, adapting to changing battlefield conditions without waiting for detailed orders. This intellectual approach to warfare produces soldiers who can exploit opportunities that more rigid armies would miss entirely. Every private becomes a tactical analyst, every sergeant a potential general. The Grande Armée's diversity reflects Napoleon's pan-European ambitions. French regiments march alongside Polish lancers, Italian infantry, German artillery, and Dutch cavalry. This international composition serves multiple purposes. It provides additional manpower, demonstrates French tolerance for allied nations, and spreads Napoleonic military techniques across Europe. Former enemies become brothers in arms under the tricolor banner. Logistical innovations support the army's unprecedented mobility. The ambulance corps, organized by Dominique Jean Larry, revolutionizes battlefield medicine by treating wounded soldiers regardless of rank or nationality. Field hospitals, supply convoys, and engineering units receive the same professional attention as combat forces. Napoleon understands that armies march on their stomachs and fight with healthy bodies. The emperor's strategic vision transforms tactical victories into strategic dominance. He doesn't just win battles. He designs campaigns that eliminate entire enemy armies through coordinated movements of multiple corps. The strategy of la maneuver sur les derrières, maneuvering against enemy rear areas, repeatedly allows smaller French forces to defeat larger coalitions by cutting their communications and forcing them to fight at disadvantage. Communication systems enable coordination across vast distances. The semaphore telegraph, linking Paris to major cities through relay stations, allows Napoleon to coordinate military and political strategy in real time. Mounted couriers, carrying messages in waterproof pouches, maintain contact between scattered corps. This information network provides Napoleon with intelligence advantages that often prove decisive. The Grande Armée's morale remains unshakable because every soldier believes he serves destiny itself. Napoleon's bulletins read aloud to gathered regiments, transform routine military operations into epic historical moments. Soldiers understand that they participate in events that will be remembered forever, that their sacrifices contribute to French glory that will outlive their individual lives. By 1805, this revolutionary military machine stands ready for its greatest test. The Third Coalition, Austria, Russia, and Britain, has formed to contain French power. Traditional European armies, trained in outdated tactics and led by conservative generals, prepare to face Napoleon's military revolution. They have no idea what awaits them. The Grande Armée represents the perfect fusion of revolutionary idealism and imperial efficiency. It embodies everything Napoleon learned from studying ancient conquerors, everything he gained from revolutionary experience, everything he dreamed of achieving through military genius. Soon these soldiers will march from Boulogne toward battlefields that will establish French dominance over continental Europe. The greatest military force in European history stands poised to prove its superiority. The awkward Corsican teenager who once memorized Caesar's campaigns has created something Caesar never imagined: an army that combines Roman discipline with revolutionary fervor, ancient tactics with modern innovation. Europe trembles before this unprecedented threat, and rightfully so. Austerlitz, December 2nd, 1805. Dawn breaks over the Moravian countryside as 73,000 French soldiers prepare for the battle that will define Napoleon's legend forever. Across the mist-shrouded Pratzen Heights, 85,000 Austrian and Russian troops await orders from their emperors. Three monarchs command armies on this frozen field: Emperor Francis of Austria, Tsar Alexander of Russia, and Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. By sunset, only one will claim victory in what history will remember as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Napoleon has maneuvered his enemies into precisely the position he desires. For weeks, he has feigned weakness, retreating from Vienna and abandoning strong defensive positions. His dispatches speak of exhausted troops and dwindling supplies. Allied spies report French demoralization and growing desertion. Even Napoleon's headquarters projects an air of barely controlled panic. But this apparent desperation masks the most sophisticated deception in military history. The truth reveals Napoleon's strategic genius at its absolute peak. Every retreat has been calculated, every sign of weakness deliberately displayed. He has drawn the Third Coalition's armies deep into Austria, far from their supply bases and reinforcements. More crucially, he has selected the battlefield where superior French tactics can achieve maximum advantage. The Allied commanders, believing they face a cornered and desperate enemy, have walked into a carefully prepared trap. Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte's, the First Corps, has executed a brilliant flanking march, appearing on Napoleon's right wing just as the battle begins. This reinforcement transforms French numerical disadvantage into rough equality, but the Allies remain unaware of their changed situation. Austrian and Russian generals still believe they outnumber Napoleon's forces significantly. Their overconfidence becomes Napoleon's greatest weapon. The Pratzen Heights dominate the battlefield like a natural fortress. These rolling hills provide commanding views of the surrounding countryside and perfect artillery positions for whoever controls them. Traditional military wisdom demands occupying such strong ground immediately. Instead, Napoleon has deliberately positioned his forces in the valley below, apparently ceding the heights to Allied forces. Allied commanders congratulate themselves on seizing this key terrain, not realizing they have fallen victim to Napoleon's psychological manipulation. At 6 a.m., Allied forces begin their grand offensive. Austrian and Russian columns descend from the Pratzen Heights toward Napoleon's deliberately weakened right wing, following a battle plan that seems to guarantee decisive victory. Their strategy appears flawless: fix French attention with frontal attacks, while overwhelming their southern flank with concentrated force. Success will cut Napoleon's army in half and destroy French power in Central Europe. Napoleon watches the Allied advance with cold satisfaction. "How long will it take you to move your division to the top of the Pratzen Heights?" he asks Marshal Nicholas Soult, commanding the 4th Corps in the center. "Less than 20 minutes, sire," Soult replies confidently. "Then we shall wait a quarter of an hour," Napoleon responds, demonstrating the precise timing that separates genius from mere competence. The Emperor's calculation proves perfect. As Allied forces descend from the heights to attack his right wing, they create exactly the opportunity Napoleon has engineered. The Pratzen Plateau, previously occupied by thousands of enemy troops, now lies almost defenseless. At precisely 9 a.m., Napoleon gives the signal that immortalizes this battle. One sharp blow, and the war is over. Soult's division storms up the Pratzen Heights with devastating effect. French infantry, advancing in column formation, overwhelm the surprised Austrian reserve forces left to guard the plateau. Within minutes, Napoleon's forces controlled the battlefield's commanding position. Allied generals, expecting to sweep French forces from the valley below, suddenly find enemies attacking from their rear. The psychological impact exceeds even the tactical advantage. Allied soldiers, advancing confidently toward what appeared to be certain victory, witnessed French tricolors appearing on heights they thought secure. Confusion spreads through Russian and Austrian ranks as officers struggle to understand how their impregnable position has been compromised. The perfectly coordinated offensive disintegrates into panicked improvisation. From the Pratzen Heights, Napoleon's artillery unleashes devastating fire on Allied forces trapped in the valley. The grand battery of cannons, positioned with mathematical precision, creates interlocking fields of fire that turn Allied columns into helpless targets. Russian guardsmen, the Tsar's elite troops, suffer appalling casualties as French cannonballs tear through their formations like scythes through wheat. Tsar Alexander, watching his finest regiments destroyed before his eyes, commits his imperial guard in desperate attempt to retake the heights. These are Russia's most elite soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns who have never tasted defeat. They advance up the slopes with magnificent courage, their bearskin caps and pristine uniforms creating a spectacle worthy of military painters. But courage cannot overcome tactical disadvantage and numerical superiority. Napoleon counters with his own guard, the grognards he has held in reserve throughout the campaign. These scarred veterans clash with Russian elite troops in fighting that epitomizes European warfare at its most ferocious. Bayonets flash in winter sunlight as French and Russian soldiers battle hand-to-hand for control of frozen ground. The outcome determines not just the battle, but the future balance of European power. French superiority in training and equipment proves decisive. Napoleon's guardsmen, fighting with revolutionary fervor and imperial discipline, gradually push Russian forces back down the heights. Tsar Alexander, witnessing the destruction of troops he considered invincible, suffers what amounts to psychological collapse. The young ruler, who dreamed of liberating Europe from French tyranny, watches his armies crumble under Napoleon's tactical mastery. The Allied southern wing, commanded by Austrian General Werther, finds itself in an impossible position. Advancing across frozen ponds toward Napoleon's deliberately weakened right wing, these troops suddenly face attack from behind as French forces occupy the Pratzen Heights. Caught between Marshal Davout's determined defense and Soult's devastating flanking fire, Allied columns disintegrate in chaos. In desperation, Russian and Austrian forces attempt to retreat across the frozen lake south of the battlefield. Napoleon, recognizing opportunity for complete victory, orders his artillery to target the ice itself. French cannonballs smash through frozen surfaces, creating gaps that trap fleeing soldiers in icy water. Hundreds of Allied troops disappear beneath the surface, their screams echoing across the winter landscape. The carnage at the Sachin Pond becomes symbolic of Napoleon's tactical ruthlessness. Traditional generals, following 18th century codes of honor, might allow defeated enemies to withdraw with dignity. Napoleon destroys them completely, understanding that mercy toward opponents enables future resistance. Complete victory requires total destruction of enemy capability and will to resist. Emperor Francis of Austria, witnessing the annihilation of his forces, sends envoys requesting immediate armistice. The proud Habsburg, who entered battle confident of French defeat, now begs for terms that will preserve his remaining troops from destruction. Within hours, the ruler of Europe's oldest dynasty acknowledges Napoleon's superiority through unconditional surrender. By 4 p.m., the Battle of Austerlitz is over. Allied casualties exceed 27,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The strategic consequences reshape European geopolitics permanently. The Holy Roman Empire, established by Charlemagne over 1,000 years earlier, dissolves as German princes abandon Habsburg leadership for Napoleonic protection. Italian states accept French hegemony. Polish patriots rally to Napoleon's banner, and European Jews see French armies as liberators from ancient persecution. Napoleon's personal transformation reaches its zenith at Austerlitz. The battle establishes him as history's greatest military tactician, a general whose strategic vision exceeds even Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. His ability to manipulate enemy psychology, control battlefield timing, and coordinate complex military operations sets new standards for military genius that future commanders will struggle to match. The son of Austerlitz, Napoleon's own phrase for this perfect victory, illuminates French supremacy across Europe. Allied generals, who dismissed Napoleon as an upstart adventurer, now recognize him as a strategic genius whose military innovations have revolutionized warfare itself. The provincial artillery officer has become the master of continental Europe through sheer intellectual superiority applied to military science. Victory at Austerlitz represents more than tactical brilliance. It demonstrates Napoleon's ability to transform strategic disadvantage into overwhelming triumph through psychological manipulation and precise timing. Outnumbered, operating far from home, facing veteran armies led by experienced generals, he has achieved total victory through mental superiority rather than material advantage. The battle's fame spreads across Europe within days, carried by survivors who speak in awed tones about French tactical mastery. Napoleon has not merely won another victory. He has established a new standard for military excellence that makes him seem almost superhuman to contemporaries. The Corsican nobody has become Europe's greatest conqueror through one perfect day of warfare in the Moravian countryside. Continental domination. October 14, 1806. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt unfold simultaneously across the Thuringian landscape as Napoleon's Grande Armée demonstrates that Austerlitz was no fluke. Within a single day, the military machine that Frederick the Great built into Europe as most feared army lies shattered across German battlefields. Prussia, the kingdom that once terrified continental Europe with its disciplined infantry and tactical precision, surrenders its capital, its fortresses, and its independence to a former artillery officer from Corsica. The Prussian collapse reveals the revolutionary nature of Napoleonic warfare. King Frederick William III commands an army frozen in 18th century tactics, soldiers who march in rigid lines, officers who follow outdated manuals, and generals who believe birth matters more than ability. Against this military museum, Napoleon deploys the concentrated fury of revolutionary France, rapid movement, flexible tactics, and merit-based leadership that transforms warfare from aristocratic ritual into scientific destruction. At Jena, Napoleon personally commands 96,000 troops against Prince Hohenlohe's 38,000 Prussians. The battle begins before dawn as French artillery positions itself on the Landgrafenberg Heights, creating a devastating crossfire that pulverizes Prussian formations before they can properly deploy. Hohenlohe's forces, advancing in textbook formation, march directly into killing zones that Napoleon has calculated with mathematical precision. Marshal Lannes leads the initial assault with typical French elan. As the Fifth Corps storms down from the heights like an avalanche, smashing through Prussian lines that crumble under combined pressure of artillery bombardment and infantry assault. Prussian officers, trained to expect leisurely 18th century warfare, cannot adapt to Napoleon's lightning-fast attacks. Their rigid tactical system, perfected under Frederick the Great 50 years earlier, proves helpless against French innovation. Simultaneously, at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout achieves an even more remarkable victory, as the Third Corps, numbering only 26,000 men, encounters the main Prussian army of 63,000 troops under Duke of Brunswick. Traditional military wisdom suggests immediate French retreat, but Davout embodies Napoleonic audacity. He attacks superior numbers with such ferocity that Prussian commanders assume they face Napoleon's entire army. The Duke of Brunswick, Frederick the Great's nephew and Prussia's most respected general, falls mortally wounded in the early fighting. His death creates immediate command confusion as subordinate generals struggle to coordinate resistance without clear leadership. French forces, trained to fight with individual initiative, exploit this Prussian paralysis ruthlessly. Davout's soldiers, outnumbered more than 2 to 1, systematically destroy Europe's most professional army through superior training and revolutionary tactics. Both battles demonstrate Napoleon's strategic genius for concentration and timing. While Prussian forces spread across multiple positions, trying to defend everything, Napoleon masses his strength at decisive points. His corps system allows rapid concentration of superior force wherever battles develop, turning local advantages into strategic dominance. The flexibility that revolutionary warfare provides proves superior to Prussian mechanical precision. King Frederick William III flees Berlin as French cavalry pursues his broken armies across northern Germany. Ancient fortresses that withstood sieges for months surrender without resistance when French columns appear at their gates. Prussian governors, witnessing their field army's destruction, conclude that further resistance equals suicide. The kingdom that once challenged Austrian hegemony in Germany becomes a French satellite within 3 weeks. Napoleon enters Berlin on October 27, 1806, riding through the Brandenburg Gate like a conquering Caesar. The same streets where Prussian guards once paraded in perfect formation now echo with French military bands playing revolutionary songs. Napoleon establishes his headquarters in Frederick the Great's palace, symbolically claiming inheritance of Prussian military tradition while demonstrating its obsolescence. From Berlin, Napoleon launches the Continental System, his most ambitious attempt to destroy British power through economic warfare. Since British naval supremacy makes direct invasion impossible, he will strangle British commerce by closing European markets to British goods. England is a nation of shopkeepers, Napoleon declares, echoing Adam Smith. When the shops close, the nation dies. The Continental System reveals Napoleon's understanding of modern warfare's economic dimensions. Military victory means nothing if enemies can finance new coalitions through commercial wealth. By controlling European ports from Hamburg to Naples, Napoleon can theoretically force Britain into bankruptcy through economic isolation. The strategy requires unprecedented continental cooperation, but Napoleon's military dominance makes such cooperation appear inevitable. Prussia's destruction creates a vacuum that Napoleon fills with German allies eager to embrace French protection. The Confederation of the Rhine, established under French patronage, includes Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and dozens of smaller states previously subject to Austrian influence. These German princes, recognizing Habsburg weakness and Napoleonic strength, align themselves with France's rising star. The Holy Roman Empire's formal dissolution follows logically from Napoleon's German victories. Emperor Francis II, unable to maintain an empire whose constituents prefer French leadership, abandons the title that links him to Charlemagne. The institution that provided European stability for over 8 centuries disappears because one man's military genius has rendered it politically irrelevant. Napoleon's reorganization of Europe extends far beyond Germany. The Kingdom of Holland falls under his brother Louis's rule, creating a buffer state that controls crucial North Sea ports. The Kingdom of Westphalia goes to brother Jerome, establishing French influence in central Germany. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw emerges from Prussian Poland, giving Napoleon a loyal ally and threatening Russia's western border. Each territorial change strengthens French strategic position while weakening potential enemies. The Tilsit meeting with Tsar Alexander I represents Napoleon's diplomatic masterpiece. On July 7, 1807, the two emperors meet on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, dividing Europe between French and Russian spheres of influence. Alexander, awed by Napoleon's military genius and charmed by his personality, agrees to enforce the continental system against British trade. The alliance transforms Europe's greatest land power into Napoleon's partner rather than enemy. French cultural influence follows military conquest across the continent. The Code Napoleon becomes law in German states, Italian kingdoms, and Polish territories, spreading French legal principles throughout Europe. French language dominates diplomatic correspondence, aristocratic salons, and intellectual discourse. European elites, recognizing French political ascendancy, adopt French customs, fashion, and ideas with eager enthusiasm. Napoleon's administrative genius appears in his management of conquered territories. Rather than simply exploiting defeated nations, he implements reforms that improve local governance while strengthening French control. Roads improve, legal systems modernize, and economic development accelerates under French administration. Conquered peoples, comparing Napoleonic efficiency with their previous government's incompetence, often prefer French rule to traditional authority. The Grande Armée's reputation reaches mythical proportions after the German campaigns. European officers study French tactical manuals, trying to understand the secrets of Napoleonic warfare. Military academies across the continent analyze battles like Jena and Auerstedt, seeking to comprehend how traditional armies can adapt to French innovations. But copying techniques proves easier than replicating the revolutionary spirit that motivates French soldiers. By 1807, Napoleon controls continental Europe more completely than any ruler since Charlemagne. French armies garrison key fortresses from Warsaw to Naples. French administrators govern German kingdoms and Italian duchies, and French law shapes civil society across multiple nations. The Corsican artillery officer has created an empire that dwarfs anything Caesar achieved, through military genius combined with political innovation. The continental system's early success seems to validate Napoleon's economic strategy. British exports decline, unemployment rises in manufacturing centers, and London's financial markets struggle with reduced trade volumes. European consumers, initially resistant to abandoning British goods, gradually accept French substitutes or domestic alternatives. The economic war appears winnable through sustained continental cooperation. But success breeds new challenges that will ultimately test Napoleon's imperial system. Managing a continent requires administrative skills that differ from military command. Enforcing economic blockades demands constant vigilance that strains French resources. Most critically, success creates expectations among Napoleon's allies and subjects that become increasingly difficult to satisfy without perpetual expansion and conquest. The emperor who began as Europe's liberator increasingly appears as its oppressor. Nations that initially welcomed French armies as harbingers of progress now resent occupation forces that extract tribute and conscripts. The revolutionary ideals that once inspired European intellectuals lose their appeal when French bayonets enforce continental system compliance. Napoleon's greatest challenge emerges not from external enemies, but from internal resistance to his imperial ambitions. Still, by 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte has achieved something unprecedented in European history. Through 10 years of continuous warfare, he has established French hegemony from the Atlantic to the Russian border. The awkward teenager who once studied Alexander the Great has surpassed his hero's achievements, creating an empire that encompasses nearly half of Europe's population and controls the continent's political destiny. The Continental System. November 21, 1806. From his headquarters in Berlin's Royal Palace, Napoleon Bonaparte signs the decree that will reshape European commerce and ultimately contribute to his downfall. The Berlin Decree declares the British Isles in a state of blockade, forbidding all trade between Britain and continental Europe. With this single document, the emperor transforms economic warfare from theoretical concept into practical policy, launching the continental system that will define the next phase of his struggle for European dominance. The continental system represents Napoleon's most ambitious strategic gamble, the attempt to defeat Britain through commercial strangulation rather than military invasion. Since British naval supremacy makes direct assault impossible, Napoleon will destroy British prosperity by closing European markets to British goods. "I will conquer the sea by the power of the land," he declares, revealing his characteristic confidence in overcoming seemingly insurmountable obstacles through sheer force of will. Napoleon's economic reasoning appears sound to contemporary observers. Britain's industrial revolution depends entirely on European markets for manufactured goods and continental sources for raw materials. British factories cannot survive without customers. British merchants cannot prosper without trade, and British government cannot function without commercial taxation. Close Europe's ports, Napoleon calculates, and British power collapses from internal economic pressure rather than external military force. The Berlin Decree's language reveals Napoleon's understanding of economic warfare's psychological dimensions. British merchants are declared enemies of the human race. British goods become contaminated merchandise, and any vessel touching British ports transforms into lawful prize, subject to seizure anywhere in French-controlled territory. This propaganda presents the blockade as moral crusade against British commercial tyranny, rather than mere economic competition. Implementation requires unprecedented continental cooperation. Napoleon must convince kings, princes, and merchant communities across Europe to sacrifice profitable British trade for French political objectives. Traditional diplomacy cannot achieve such compliance. Only military dominance makes economic coercion possible. The continental system becomes both consequence and justification for continued territorial expansion. Initial success seems to validate Napoleon's strategy. British exports to continental Europe declined by 25% within the first year as French customs officials seized British goods in Hamburg, Amsterdam, Genoa, and Naples. British manufacturers, suddenly deprived of traditional markets, reduce production and dismiss workers. London's financial districts witness unprecedented anxiety as merchants scramble to find alternative trade routes. But the continental system reveals fundamental contradictions that ultimately undermine its effectiveness. European consumers demand British goods, superior textiles, refined sugar, tropical products, and manufactured items that continental producers cannot match in quality or price. Prohibiting these imports creates immediate shortages that drive prices upward and generate popular resentment against French economic policies. Smuggling becomes a continental epidemic as merchants discover that British goods command premium prices in blockaded markets. Coastal communities from Denmark to Italy develop elaborate networks for evading French customs controls. British merchants, adapting quickly to new conditions, establish alternative supply routes through neutral ports in Turkey, Russia, and Scandinavia. The economic blockade becomes a profitable adventure for criminal organizations. French satellite states suffer disproportionately from continental system enforcement. Holland's commercial prosperity depends entirely on international trade, particularly with British partners developed over centuries of maritime commerce. King Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother and Holland's reluctant ruler, faces impossible choices between French political demands and Dutch economic survival. His attempts to moderate blockade enforcement create immediate conflict with imperial policy. The Spanish ulcer begins festering in 1808 when Napoleon attempts to extend continental system control to the Iberian Peninsula. King Charles IV's weakness and Crown Prince Ferdinand's ambitions provide pretexts for French intervention. But Spanish popular resistance transforms what Napoleon expects to be routine occupation into prolonged guerrilla warfare. The Spanish people, united by religious faith and national pride, launch Europe's first modern war of national liberation. Guerrilla warfare in Spain reveals the continental system's military costs. Napoleon must deploy over 300,000 troops to maintain control of Spanish territory and suppress popular uprising. These forces, desperately needed elsewhere, become trapped in endless counterinsurgency operations against enemies who disappear into mountainous terrain after striking French supply convoys. The Spanish running sore bleeds French military strength continuously. British support for Spanish guerrillas demonstrates the continental system's strategic weaknesses. The Royal Navy, controlling Mediterranean sea routes, supplies Spanish insurgents with weapons, ammunition, and financial subsidies that sustain their resistance indefinitely. British expeditionary forces under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, established secure bases in Portugal, creating permanent threats to French occupation forces throughout the peninsula. Economic hardships generated by the continental system provoke growing resentment across Napoleon's empire. German merchants, deprived of profitable British trade, increasingly resent French economic policies that benefit France while harming allied nations. Italian businessmen, cut off from traditional British markets, question whether French protection compensates for commercial losses. Even French industrialists complain about British competition in colonial markets beyond European blockade control. The continental system's enforcement requires an ever-expanding bureaucracy that strains French administrative resources. Customs officials, harbor inspectors, and commercial tribunals multiply across the empire as Napoleon attempts to plug every potential leak in his economic blockade. These officials, often corrupt and frequently incompetent, create additional grievances among populations already suffering from trade restrictions. Neutral nations face impossible pressures as Napoleon demands complete compliance with continental system requirements. Denmark, Sweden, and Portugal must choose between economic ruin through British naval blockade or political destruction through French military occupation. These smaller nations, caught between competing imperial demands, often attempt to satisfy both sides through secret agreements that ultimately satisfy neither. The Russian alliance, crucial for continental system success, begins showing strain as early as 1809. Tsar Alexander I, initially charmed by Napoleon's personality and impressed by French military power, gradually recognizes that economic cooperation with France damages Russian commercial interests. Russian nobles, deprived of British luxury imports and profitable grain exports, pressure their emperor to reconsider the French alliance. British countermeasures prove more effective than Napoleon anticipates. The Orders in Council, requiring neutral ships to obtain British licenses before trading with continental Europe, transformed the economic war into a complex chess match where every move generates countermoves. British diplomacy, backed by naval power and commercial incentives, gradually constructs alternative trade networks that circumvent French blockade efforts. Colonial markets become increasingly important as European trade declines. British merchants, excluded from continental Europe, expand operations in India, the Americas, and other overseas territories beyond French control. This geographical diversification reduces British dependence on European customers while providing new sources of raw materials and commercial profits. The continental system inadvertently accelerates British imperial expansion. French public opinion grows increasingly skeptical about continental system benefits. Parisian consumers, deprived of sugar, coffee, and colonial products, begin questioning whether British defeat justifies domestic hardship. French manufacturers, initially enthusiastic about eliminating British competition, discover that reduced trade volumes harm everyone's prosperity. Popular support for the economic war erodes as its costs become apparent. By 1810, the continental system has achieved partial success while revealing fundamental limitations. British exports have declined significantly. British unemployment has increased, and British financial markets have experienced serious disruption. The British adaptation, continental resistance, and enforcement difficulties prevent the decisive economic victory Napoleon requires to justify his strategy's enormous costs. The system's greatest weakness lies in its dependence on perfect compliance across an enormous territory with diverse economic interests. Any significant breach, whether through neutral nation defection, satellite state rebellion, or widespread smuggling, undermines the entire strategy. Napoleon cannot simultaneously fight military campaigns, administer a continental empire, and enforce economic blockade without overextending French resources dangerously. Most critically, the continental system transforms Napoleon from Europe's liberator into its oppressor. Nations that initially welcomed French armies as harbingers of progress now see them as instruments of economic exploitation. The revolutionary ideals that once inspired European intellectuals lose their appeal when French bayonets enforce commercial policies that harm local populations for distant political objectives. The economic war has become a political liability that will ultimately contribute to Napoleon's downfall. The Spanish ulcer continues draining French military strength. Russian cooperation grows increasingly unreliable, and popular resentment spreads across the empire. Napoleon's greatest strategic innovation has created more problems than it solves, setting the stage for the disasters that lie ahead. The Russian catastrophe. June 24, 1812. The morning sun illuminates the largest army in human history as beyond us. 600,000 soldiers from across Napoleon's empire cross the Niemen River into Russia. The Grande Armée stretches for miles. French veterans marching alongside Polish lancers, Italian infantry, German cavalry, and Dutch artillery. 20 nations unite under Napoleon's eagles for what he promises will be his final campaign, the decisive blow that will secure European peace under French hegemony. None of these soldiers suspect they are marching toward the greatest military disaster in European history. Napoleon has assembled this unprecedented force to compel Russian compliance with the continental system. Tsar Alexander I's gradual abandonment of economic cooperation with France threatens to unravel Napoleon's entire strategy for defeating Britain. Russian ports have reopened to British trade. Russian nobles demand luxury imports, and Russian merchants profit from violating the blockade. One good battle, Napoleon tells his marshals, and Alexander will sue for peace. The emperor's confidence rests on 20 years of unbroken victory. Every enemy coalition has collapsed before French tactical superiority. Every European capital has opened its gates to French armies, and every monarch has eventually acknowledged Napoleon's supremacy. Russia appears no different from Austria, Prussia, or Spain, another backward nation whose military forces will crumble under revolutionary pressure from the Grande Armée. But Russia offers unique challenges that Napoleon's previous enemies lacked. The vast distances between cities make traditional lightning campaigns impossible. The sparse population provides insufficient supplies for enormous armies accustomed to living off conquered territory. Most critically, the severe climate imposes timing constraints that limit campaign duration to a few months each year. Napoleon enters the theater where his greatest advantages, speed, concentration, and tactical flexibility, may prove irrelevant. Tsar Alexander adopts a strategy that neutralizes French tactical superiority through systematic withdrawal. Rather than offering decisive battle that Napoleon craves, Russian forces retreat steadily eastward, destroying everything useful to invading armies. Bridges burn, granaries empty, and wells fill with poison as Russians implement scorched earth tactics that deny French forces the supplies they desperately need. The Russian strategy exploits Napoleon's greatest weakness, logistical overextension. The Grande Armée's unprecedented size requires enormous supply convoys that cannot possibly keep pace with advancing forces. Soldiers accustomed to finding food and shelter in conquered territories discover empty villages and barren countryside. The legendary army that once moved faster than any force in history now crawls across endless plains like a wounded beast. July 28, 1812. The Battle of Smolensk offers Napoleon his first chance for decisive victory, but Russian General Barclay de Tolly withdraws his forces before French encirclement can close. The ancient city burns for 3 days, its flames visible from miles away, symbolizing Russian determination to sacrifice everything rather than submit to French domination. Napoleon captures smoking ruins instead of the Russian army he desperately needs to destroy. The burning of Smolensk reveals the Russian strategy's psychological dimensions. By destroying their own cities rather than allowing French occupation, Russians demonstrate that they prefer national death to foreign subjugation. This fanatic resistance, unprecedented in Napoleon's experience, makes negotiated settlement impossible. Either the Grande Armée destroys Russian military power completely, or Russia destroys the Grande Armée through sheer endurance. August passes in futile pursuit as Russian forces continue their maddening retreat. Napoleon's soldiers, exhausted by endless marching across barren landscape, begin deserting in unprecedented numbers. Disease spreads through overcrowded camps where sanitation collapses under campaign pressures. The Grande Armée's strength evaporates through attrition even before major battles begin, falling from 600,000 to fewer than 400,000 effective troops. September 7, 1812. The Battle of Borodino finally provides the decisive confrontation Napoleon has sought since crossing the Niemen. Russian General Mikhail Kutuzov, yielding to political pressure for battle, positions 120,000 troops in strong defensive positions outside Moscow. Napoleon commands roughly equal numbers, but his forces suffer from months of grueling campaigning while Russian soldiers fight on their homeland as sacred soil. Borodino becomes a butcher's battle that epitomizes Napoleonic warfare's destructive evolution. French artillery fires over 90,000 rounds in 12 hours of continuous bombardment, turning Russian earthworks into lunar landscapes of shattered bodies and smoking craters. Russian batteries respond with equal fury, decimating French infantry formations that advance with suicidal courage across open ground. The mathematical precision that characterized Napoleon's early victories degenerates into mindless carnage. The battle's outcome remains ambiguous despite appalling casualties. French forces technically control the battlefield after Russian withdrawal, but Kutuzov's army retreats in good order toward Moscow. Napoleon has gained tactical victory while suffering strategic defeat. He has destroyed neither Russian military capacity nor political will to resist. Both armies lose over 30,000 men in Europe's bloodiest single day of warfare. September 14, 1812. Napoleon enters Moscow expecting triumphant vindication of his Russian strategy. The ancient capital's capture should force Alexander's surrender and validate the enormous costs of this campaign. Instead, he finds an abandoned city whose Russian inhabitants have fled, leaving behind empty palaces and silent streets. Moscow offers no political victory, no military advantage, and worst of all, no supplies for his starving army. That night, fires begin spreading through Moscow's wooden buildings. Whether started by Russian agents or French negligence remains unclear, but the flames consume 4/5 of the city within a week. Napoleon watches from the Kremlin as the capital he hoped to use for winter quarters becomes a smoking wasteland. The emperor, who once boasted of conquering by speed, now finds himself trapped in a burning maze with winter approaching. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waits in Moscow's ruins for Russian surrender that never comes. Tsar Alexander, supported by his nobles and inspired by popular resistance, refuses all peace overtures. Russian armies, reinforced by militia units and Cossack irregulars, gather strength while the Grande Armée weakens through disease, desertion, and despair. Every day of delay makes French strategic position more desperate. October 19, 1812. Napoleon finally acknowledges reality and orders retreat from Moscow. The Grande Armée, reduced to 100,000 effective troops, begins the longest and most terrible withdrawal in military history. Russian winter, arriving early and with unprecedented severity, transforms tactical retreat into humanitarian catastrophe. Soldiers who conquered Europe freeze to death on roads that become rivers of ice and suffering. The retreat reveals the Grande Armée's total collapse as a military organization. Disciplined formations disintegrate into panicked mobs of starving men who abandon weapons, equipment, and wounded comrades in desperate attempts at individual survival. Officers lose control of their units, units lose contact with headquarters, and the entire command structure dissolves under environmental pressures no European army has ever experienced. Russian forces, perfectly adapted to winter warfare, harass the French retreat with devastating effectiveness. Cossack cavalry appears wherever French columns are most vulnerable, striking supply convoys and isolated detachments before disappearing into the frozen landscape. Regular Russian troops block river crossings and occupy strategic towns, forcing French forces into deadly detours through impassable terrain. November 26 to 29, 1812. The crossing of the Berezina River epitomizes the Grande Armée's agony. Russian forces control both banks while French engineers struggle to construct bridges over icy water under enemy fire. Thousands of soldiers and camp followers crowd onto fragile wooden spans that collapse under excessive weight, plunging screaming victims into freezing currents. The river becomes a mass grave for Napoleon's imperial dreams. Napoleon himself barely escapes the Russian catastrophe. On December 5th, he abandons his army to return to Paris, claiming that European political crisis requires his immediate attention. This desertion, following his earlier abandonment of troops in Egypt, establishes a pattern that undermines his legend of loyalty to his soldiers. The emperor, who once inspired fanatical devotion, now appears to value his personal survival above his army's fate. December 14, 1812. The last organized remnants of the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen back into Prussia. Of the 600,000 men who entered Russia 6 months earlier, fewer than 40,000 return as effective soldiers. The rest lie dead in Russian snow, die in prison camps, or wander as refugees across Eastern Europe. The military machine that conquered half of Europe has been annihilated by Russian endurance and winter weather. The Russian disaster's consequences extend far beyond military casualties. European nations, witnessing French vulnerability for the first time, begin defecting from Napoleon's empire. Prussia switches sides, Austria prepares for war, and even satellite kingdoms reconsider their loyalty to French leadership. The aura of invincibility that sustained Napoleon's empire vanishes in the frozen wastes of Russia. Most critically, the Russian catastrophe reveals that Napoleon's military genius has limits. His tactical brilliance, so effective in quick European campaigns, proves helpless against enemies who refuse decisive battle in environments that impose their own strategic logic. The emperor, who seemed to control destiny itself, has discovered that some forces, distance, climate, and national resistance, remain beyond even his extraordinary capabilities. The retreat from Moscow marks the beginning of Napoleon's end. The man who once boasted he would conquer the world has lost his greatest army in the Russian wilderness, setting in motion the chain of events that will ultimately destroy his empire and exile him to distant islands. The coalition closes in. February 28, 1813. In a modest inn at Kalisz, the King of Prussia signs the convention that transforms European politics forever. Frederick William III, the monarch who fled Berlin in terror after Jena, now allies with Tsar Alexander I against their former conqueror. The Russo-Prussian alliance marks the beginning of the Sixth Coalition, the final convergence of European powers that will end Napoleon's empire and reshape the continental balance forever. The Russian catastrophe has shattered the myth of French invincibility that held Napoleon's empire together through fear. European monarchs, witnessing the Grande Armée's destruction, recognize their opportunity for revenge against the Corsican upstart who humiliated their dynasties for 15 years. But they also understand that defeating Napoleon requires unprecedented cooperation among nations that have fought each other for centuries. Napoleon returns to Paris, facing the greatest crisis of his career. The Russian disaster has cost him 500,000 soldiers, destroyed his military reputation, and exposed French vulnerability to every enemy in Europe. Worse, his empire's internal contradictions finally emerge as satellite. Kingdoms abandon their loyalty, and subject populations rise in nationalist revolts. The continental system, already weakening, collapses as nations choose economic survival over French political objectives. The emperor demonstrates characteristic resilience by immediately raising new armies from France's depleted manpower reserves. Through desperate conscription of teenagers and veterans, he assembles 200,000 troops within 4 months, a logistical miracle that proves French administrative efficiency under extreme pressure. These raw recruits, nicknamed Marie-Louises after Napoleon's young empress, lack the experience of the Grande Armée's veterans, but they possess revolutionary enthusiasm and imperial training. Spring 1813 witnesses Napoleon's remarkable return to form as he launches the German campaign with vintage audacity. At Lutzen on May 2nd, his young conscripts defeat a Russo-Prussian army through superior tactics and concentrated artillery fire. 2 weeks later, at Bautzen, Napoleon again demonstrates his tactical genius by outmaneuvering Allied forces that outnumber his own troops. These victories prove that the emperor's military skills survive despite the Russian disaster. But Napoleon's German victories cannot disguise his deteriorating strategic position. Each battle costs irreplaceable veterans, while Allied armies receive constant reinforcements from their vast territorial reserves. French forces, operating far from home without reliable supply lines, gradually weaken through attrition, even when winning tactical engagements. The mathematics of warfare have turned against Napoleon for the first time in his career. The Armistice of Clausewitz, signed June 4, 1813, provides both sides with breathing space while fundamentally altering the war's dynamics. Napoleon uses the ceasefire to reinforce his armies and reorganize his administration, but the Allies gain far greater advantages. Austria abandons its neutrality to join the coalition, transforming the conflict from regional dispute into continental war. British subsidies flow freely to Allied treasuries, providing unlimited financing for extended campaigns. Metternich's diplomacy proves as decisive as battlefield victories in destroying Napoleon's empire. The Austrian foreign minister, understanding that lasting peace requires balance rather than French hegemony, constructs a coalition united by shared interest in limiting Napoleon's power. His Congress of Prague offers Napoleon territorial concessions that would have satisfied any reasonable ruler, but Napoleon's megalomaniac ambitions make compromise impossible. August 1830 marks the coalition's strategic breakthrough as three Allied armies converge on Napoleon from different directions. The Bohemian army under Schwarzenberg advances from the south. Blücher's army of Silesia threatens from the east, and Bernadotte's northern army approaches from the Baltic coast. This coordinated offensive forces Napoleon to divide his attention among multiple threats, preventing the concentration of force that characterizes his greatest victories. Napoleon's response reveals both his tactical brilliance and strategic limitations. He defeats each Allied army individually: Schwarzenberg at Dresden, Blücher at the Katzbach, Bernadotte at Dennewitz, but cannot achieve decisive results because enemy forces simply retreat and regroup. The Allies have finally learned to fight Napoleon successfully by refusing climactic battles while maintaining constant pressure through coordinated operations. The German population's reaction proves as damaging to French interests as military defeats. Nationalist enthusiasm, suppressed for years under French occupation, explodes into open rebellion as Allied armies advance. German students volunteer for irregular units. Poets compose patriotic verses celebrating liberation, and common citizens provide intelligence that helps Allied forces avoid French traps. Napoleon faces enemies among civilian populations as well as opposing armies. October 16th to 19th, 1813. The Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, becomes the largest and most decisive engagement in European history before World War I. Over 500,000 soldiers clash across fields outside the Saxon capital as Napoleon confronts the combined might of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. For 4 days, the fate of Europe hangs in balance as French tactical skill battles Allied numerical superiority. The battle's first day demonstrates Napoleon's enduring genius as he coordinates simultaneous attacks against multiple enemy positions. French artillery, still superior in technique and equipment, creates devastating crossfire that disrupts Allied formations. The Young Guard, thrown into action at critical moments, proves that French military spirit survives despite recent disasters. Napoleon's presence on the battlefield continues inspiring superhuman efforts from soldiers who worship their emperor. But the battle scale overwhelms even Napoleon's exceptional abilities. He cannot be everywhere simultaneously, cannot coordinate every movement personally, and cannot overcome mathematical disadvantages through tactical brilliance alone. Allied forces, learning from previous defeats, avoid concentrated attacks that play to French strengths while maintaining steady pressure that gradually exhausts French reserves. The second day brings Allied reinforcements that transform rough equality into overwhelming superiority. Bernadotte's Swedes arrive from the north. Bagratión's Russians approach from the east, and additional Austrian corps strengthen Schwarzenberg's southern attack. Napoleon faces 300,000 enemies with only 185,000 troops, many of whom are unreliable Saxon and Württemberg units ready to defect at the first opportunity. October 18th witnesses the coalition's most dangerous moment as Napoleon launches desperate counterattacks that nearly break Allied lines. French cavalry charges with suicidal courage. Infantry assaults positions that seem impregnable, and artillery fires with mathematical precision that pulverizes enemy formations. For several hours, Napoleon's tactical mastery threatens to achieve impossible victory against overwhelming odds. The defection of Saxon troops during the battle's climax seals Napoleon's fate. These German units, forced to fight their own countrymen under French command, suddenly change sides and attack their former allies. This betrayal creates gaps in French lines that Allied forces exploit immediately. Napoleon's army, already outnumbered and exhausted, faces collapse as enemies attack from unexpected directions. Napoleon orders retreat on October 19th, abandoning Leipzig and its enormous supply magazines to Allied forces. The French army's withdrawal becomes a disaster as swollen rivers block escape routes while Allied cavalry pursues ruthlessly. The explosion of Leipzig's only bridge traps thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side of the Elster River, forcing their surrender to Allied forces. The strategic consequences of Leipzig exceed even the Russian disaster and their impact on Napoleon's empire. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolves as German princes abandon French alliance for Allied protection. Holland rises in nationalist revolt, expelling French administrators and welcoming British landing forces. Italy wavers between loyalty and rebellion as Austrian armies threaten French positions throughout the peninsula. Most critically, the coalition armies advance toward the Rhine frontier, threatening to invade France itself for the first time since 1793. European monarchs, intoxicated by their unprecedented victory over Napoleon, demand territorial concessions that would reduce France to its pre-revolutionary borders. The empire that once stretched from Spain to Poland faces complete dismemberment by enemies drunk on revenge. Napoleon retreats across Germany with the remnants of his army, fighting brilliant rearguard actions that demonstrate his tactical genius even in defeat. At Hanau, he smashes through Bavarian forces trying to block his withdrawal. Throughout the retreat, he maintains discipline and morale among troops who could easily despair at their desperate situation. The emperor's personal courage and military skill remain intact despite strategic catastrophe. By December 1813, Napoleon has reached the Rhine with fewer than 70,000 effective troops. Behind him lies a Germany in revolt, satellite kingdoms in collapse, and Allied armies preparing to invade France. Ahead lies a nation exhausted by 20 years of continuous warfare, drained of young men by endless conscription, and increasingly doubtful about their emperor's ability to protect them from foreign conquest. By December 1813, Napoleon has reached the Rhine with fewer than 70,000 effective troops. Behind him lies a Germany in revolt, satellite kingdoms in collapse, and Allied armies preparing to invade France. Ahead lies a nation exhausted by 20 years of continuous warfare, drained of young men by endless conscription, and increasingly doubtful about their emperor's ability to protect them from foreign conquest. By December 1813, Napoleon has reached the Rhine with fewer than 70,000 effective troops. Behind him lies a Germany in revolt, satellite kingdoms in collapse, and Allied armies preparing to invade France. Ahead lies a nation exhausted by 20 years of continuous warfare, drained of young men by endless conscription, and increasingly doubtful about their emperor's ability to protect them from foreign conquest. The coalition stands at the French frontier, united in their determination to end Napoleon's empire once and for all. The boy from Corsica, who once conquered half of Europe, now faces invasion of his own homeland by enemies, who have finally learned how to defeat him. 100 Days in Waterloo. March 1st, 1815. The Mediterranean dawn illuminates a small flotilla as it approaches the French coast near Cannes. Aboard the brig Inconstant, Napoleon Bonaparte paces the deck with characteristic nervous energy, studying the shoreline where his greatest gamble will begin. Behind him lies Elba, the tiny island kingdom that European powers granted him after his abdication. Ahead lies France, the empire he abandoned 11 months earlier, and the final roll of dice that will determine whether he dies as a forgotten exile or returns as the master of Europe. The decision to escape Elba emerges from Napoleon's absolute inability to accept obscurity. Exile on a Mediterranean island, no matter how comfortable, cannot satisfy a man who once commanded continental Europe. Reports from France speak of Bourbon incompetence, military dissatisfaction, and popular nostalgia for imperial glory. The eagle, Napoleon tells his handful of followers, will fly from steeple to steeple until it reaches the towers of Notre Dame. Louis XVIII's Restoration government has made every possible mistake in managing post-Napoleonic France. The returned emigrants demand compensation for revolutionary confiscations, threatening the property rights that millions of French citizens gained through 25 years of political upheaval. The White Terror targets former revolutionaries and imperial officials, creating enemies throughout French society. Most critically, the Bourbon regime treats Napoleonic veterans with contempt, dismissing experienced officers and reducing military pensions. Napoleon's landing at Gulf Juan launches the most audacious political comeback in European history. With only 1,000 loyal soldiers from Elba's garrison, he begins marching toward Paris through Alpine valleys, where his legend remains strongest. The government dispatches troops to arrest him, but regiment after regiment defects to the returning emperor. The soldier cannot fire upon Napoleon becomes the common refrain as military units abandon Bourbon loyalty for imperial nostalgia. March 7, 1815. At Laffrey, near Grenoble, Napoleon encounters the 5th Infantry Regiment blocking his path to Paris. The confrontation epitomizes the 100 Days' dramatic momentum as Napoleon walks alone toward leveled muskets, opens his famous gray coat, and declares, "If there is one among you who wants to kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers, overcome by emotion, throw down their weapons and rally to their former commander with tears streaming down their faces. The psychological impact spreads across France like wildfire. Marshal Ney, who promised Louis XVIII to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, instead joins his former master after a brief meeting that rekindles their old partnership. Military garrisons throughout eastern France declare for Napoleon as news of his advance creates unprecedented excitement among populations weary of Bourbon rule. March 20th, 1815. Napoleon enters Paris in triumph as Louis XVIII flees toward the Belgian frontier. The Tuileries Palace, abandoned by the Bourbon court, welcomes its former occupant like a familiar home. Within hours, imperial eagles replace Bourbon lily on government buildings, while Parisian crowds cheer their returned emperor with enthusiasm that recalls the revolutionary era as great moments. But Napoleon's political resurrection faces impossible strategic constraints. The Congress of Vienna, interrupted by news of his escape, immediately declares him an enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world. The Seventh Coalition forms with unprecedented speed as Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia pledge 150,000 troops each for Napoleon's final destruction. European powers, having defeated him once, refused to repeat the diplomatic mistakes that allowed his previous comebacks. Napoleon attempts to present himself as a reformed ruler committed to constitutional monarchy and European peace. The additional act to the constitutions of the empire promises liberal reforms, parliamentary government, and respect for individual rights. This political transformation, however sincere, cannot overcome the fundamental reality that Europe's monarchs view his very existence as an intolerable threat to legitimate authority. The military situation becomes desperate as allied armies converge on France from multiple directions. Wellington commands Anglo-Dutch forces in Belgium. Blucher leads Prussian troops in the Rhineland, while Austrian and Russian armies prepare offensives along France's eastern frontier. Napoleon faces 700,000 enemies with barely 200,000 loyal troops, many of whom are untested conscripts hastily assembled during his march to Paris. Napoleon's strategic Genius emerges one final time as he designs a campaign to exploit Allied coordination problems. Rather than waiting for simultaneous attacks from all directions, he will strike the nearest enemy forces in Belgium before they can unite with other coalition armies. "I shall maneuver in such a way," he explains to his marshals, "as to fight 200,000 men with my 125,000, instead of allowing 400,000 to fight against me." June 15, 1815. Napoleon crosses the Belgian frontier with 125,000 troops in the last offensive campaign of his career. The Army of the North, hastily organized but containing many imperial veterans, moves with vintage Napoleonic speed toward the gap between Wellington's Anglo-Dutch forces and Blücher's Prussian army. Success requires defeating both enemies separately before they can coordinate their superior numbers against French forces. June 16th brings simultaneous battles at Contrebrass and Ligny that nearly achieve Napoleon's strategic objectives. While Marshal Ney fights Wellington to a standstill at the Crossroads village, Napoleon personally commands the main attack against Blücher's Prussians. The Battle of Ligny inflicts severe casualties on Prussian forces and wounds the elderly Blücher himself, apparently eliminating one enemy army from the forthcoming decisive engagement. But Napoleon's physical condition betrays him at the campaign's crucial moment. Suffering from painful hemorrhoids, bladder problems, and possible stomach cancer, the 46-year-old emperor cannot maintain the superhuman energy levels that characterized his greatest victories. His delayed reactions, unclear orders, and periodic lethargy create coordination problems that prevent complete exploitation of tactical successes. June 17th passes in confusion as Napoleon loses contact with both enemy armies while his own forces struggle with contradictory movement orders. Marshal Grouchy, pursuing the apparently defeated Prussians with 33,000 troops, fails to prevent Blücher's army from regrouping and marching toward Wellington's position. This intelligence failure dooms Napoleon's strategy by allowing enemy forces to unite against him. June 18, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo begins on rain-soaked fields south of Brussels as Napoleon finally confronts Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army in the decisive engagement both commanders have sought. But Napoleon faces not just Wellington's 68,000 troops deployed along Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, but also the imminent arrival of Blücher's Prussians marching from the east. Time works against French interests, as every hour of delay increases the odds of facing overwhelming enemy numbers. The morning passes in ominous preparation, as both armies wait for the ground to dry sufficiently for effective artillery and cavalry operations. Napoleon, studying Wellington's positions through his telescope, remarks to his staff, "Because you have been beaten by Wellington, you think he's a good general. But I tell you that Wellington is a bad general, that the English are bad troops, and that this will be a picnic." At 11:30, a Meyer-end French artillery opens the battle with a grand battery of 80 cannons that pounds Anglo-Dutch positions on the ridge. The bombardment, intended to soften enemy resistance before infantry assault, proves less effective than Napoleon expects because Wellington has positioned his troops on the reverse slope where they suffer minimal casualties from artillery fire. This tactical innovation neutralizes French firepower advantage. The attack on Hougoumont Chateau epitomizes Waterloo's brutal character as French forces repeatedly assault the fortified position throughout the day. The ancient buildings become a microcosm of the larger battle. Desperate attacks met by stubborn defense, rooms changing hands multiple times, and casualties mounting without decisive result. Napoleon's tactical genius, so effective in mobile warfare, proves less dominant in this grinding battle of attrition. At 1:30 p.m., Napoleon launches the main French assault as Durlin, as the First Corps advances up the slope toward Wellington's center. 20,000 French infantry march in magnificent formation toward Anglo-Dutch positions, their eagles glinting in afternoon sunlight. But Wellington's reverse slope deployment conceals British infantry until French columns reach point-blank range, where devastating volleys shatter attack formations. The appearance of Prussian forces on Napoleon's right flank transforms tactical battle into strategic catastrophe. Blücher's troops, arriving earlier than Napoleon calculated, force him to divide his attention between Wellington's army and this new threat. French reserves, desperately needed to exploit success against Anglo-Dutch positions, must instead contain Prussian attacks that threaten to envelop the entire French army. Napoleon's final gamble comes at 7:30 p.m. as he commits his Imperial Guard in one last desperate assault against Wellington's weakening center. These veterans of 100 battles advance with the same disciplined courage that conquered Europe, their bearskin caps and blue uniforms inspiring awe even among enemies. For a moment, it seems the Guard's legendary invincibility might snatch victory from approaching defeat. But the Guard's repulse by British infantry marks the end of Napoleonic warfare's greatest era. The cry, "La Garde, recule," the Guard retreats, spreads panic through French ranks that have never seen their elite troops defeated. 20 years of French military dominance ends as Wellington's army advances from Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, while Prussian forces attack French flanks and rear. By 9 p.m., the French army has dissolved in complete rout. Napoleon himself barely escapes capture as Allied cavalry pursues his broken forces across the Belgian countryside. The emperor who once boasted of conquering by the sword now flees toward Paris with the remnants of his final army. The 100 Days have ended in the most decisive military defeat in European history. The retreat from Waterloo becomes a nightmare of collapsed discipline and shattered dreams. French soldiers, who marched into Belgium with renewed confidence in their emperor's genius, now stumble through darkness as fugitives from the greatest defeat in their military history. Artillery pieces abandoned along roadsides, eagles buried in muddy fields, and standards burned to prevent capture marked the trail of Napoleon's final catastrophe. Napoleon reaches Paris on June 21, 1815, to find a city transformed by news of Waterloo. The Chamber of Deputies, emboldened by military disaster, demands his immediate abdication. Liberal politicians who once supported imperial reform now view Napoleon as an obstacle to negotiated peace with the advancing Allies. Even his most loyal supporters recognize that his political survival would condemn France to invasion and dismemberment. The emperor who once commanded the loyalty of half Europe finds himself isolated in his own capital. Marshal Devout, the Iron Marshal who never lost a battle under Napoleon's command, advises immediate abdication to save France from further suffering. Lucien Bonaparte, the brother who helped orchestrate the coup of 18 Brumaire, now urges acceptance of political reality. The imperial court, so recently restored to Tuileries splendor, dissolves as quickly as it had reformed. June 22, 1815. Napoleon signs his second abdication, renouncing power in favor of my son, in a futile attempt to preserve Bonaparte's succession. The document represents more than political capitulation. It marks the end of an era that began with revolutionary fervor and concludes with imperial exhaustion. The man who once proclaimed himself master of destiny now submits to forces beyond his control. The former emperor's attempts to escape to America reveal the extent of his political isolation. British naval patrols blockade French ports while Allied armies converge on Paris from multiple directions. Even neutral nations refuse sanctuary to the man whom European powers have declared an international outlaw. Napoleon's options narrow to surrender or death, and his survival instincts choose the former. July 15, 1815. Napoleon boards HM Bellerophon in Rochefort Harbor, surrendering to Captain Frederick Maitland with the famous words, "I come to throw myself upon the protection of your laws." This surrender to British naval power symbolizes the complete reversal of fortune for a man who once planned to invade England itself. The emperor who dreamed of global domination now depends on enemy generosity for his very survival. The British government's decision to exile Napoleon to St. Helena reflects both mercy and calculated cruelty. Rather than execution, which would create a martyred legend, they choose living burial on an isolated Atlantic island from which escape proves impossible. St. Helena, 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass, becomes Napoleon's final kingdom, a rocky prison where the former master of Europe will spend his remaining 6 years, dictating memoirs and dreaming of vanished glory. The Waterloo campaign's failure demonstrates how Napoleon's greatest strengths became fatal weaknesses when circumstances changed. His legendary speed proved irrelevant when enemies learned to coordinate their movements. His tactical genius could not overcome strategic disadvantages created by overwhelming enemy numbers. His ability to inspire soldiers failed when those soldiers recognized that following their emperor meant certain death or capture. Most critically, Napoleon's inability to accept compromise destroyed any possibility of negotiated settlement. The Congress of Vienna offered territorial concessions that would have preserved French dignity while limiting French power. But Napoleon's all-or-nothing mentality, so effective in military campaigns, proved disastrous in political situations requiring flexibility and moderation. The 100 Days also reveal how completely European attitudes toward Napoleon had changed since his first abdication. In 1814, many Europeans viewed him as a fallen titan worthy of respect despite his defeat. By 1815, he had become an anachronistic threat to continental peace, a relic of revolutionary violence in an age seeking stability. His attempt to reclaim power appeared not as heroic comeback, but as selfish ambition, endangering millions of lives. Wellington's victory at Waterloo establishes the Iron Duke as Napoleon's equal in military genius, while representing a new kind of warfare based on defensive tactics and allied coordination. The battle proves that Napoleonic innovations, so revolutionary 20 years earlier, have been absorbed and countered by enemies who learned from their defeats. Military evolution has passed Napoleon by, making his tactical brilliance increasingly obsolete. The battle's aftermath witnesses scenes that epitomize the Napoleonic era's ending. French Imperial Guard survivors, their legendary discipline finally broken, wander Belgian fields like ghosts of former glory. Allied soldiers, many of whom secretly admired Napoleon's military genius, search among the dead for souvenirs of history's most famous general. The romantic age of individual military genius dies with the Grande Armée on Waterloo's muddy fields. By midnight on June 18, 1815, the career that began with revolutionary promise in Italian valleys concludes with imperial catastrophe on Belgian plains. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered almost half the world through audacity, genius, and revolutionary fervor, has finally encountered limits that even his extraordinary abilities cannot overcome. The legend ends where it began, with the sound of cannon fire and the sight of French eagles retreating into history. How did Napoleon Bonaparte conquer almost half of the world? The answer lies not in any single factor, but in a perfect convergence of revolutionary circumstances, personal genius, and historical opportunity that created the most extraordinary military career in European history. Napoleon succeeded because he revolutionized warfare itself. While his enemies clung to 18th century tactics of rigid formations and leisurely campaigns, he unleashed lightning-fast maneuvers, concentrated firepower, and merit-based leadership that transformed battlefields into laboratories of mathematical precision. The core system allowed unprecedented flexibility. The Grande Armée moved faster than any force in history, and revolutionary enthusiasm motivated soldiers to achieve what previous generations thought impossible. But Napoleon's conquests transcended mere military innovation. He embodied the revolutionary ideals that swept across Europe, promising liberation from aristocratic oppression and advancement through individual merit. French armies didn't just occupy territories. They carried the principles of liberty, equality, and legal reform that appealed to populations suffering under feudal systems. Decode Napoleon, administrative efficiency, and religious tolerance made French rule preferable to traditional monarchy for millions of Europeans. The strategic genius that enabled his conquests also contained the seeds of his destruction. Napoleon's inability to accept limitations drove him from brilliant victories like Austerlitz toward disasters like Russia. His continental system, designed to strangle British commerce, ultimately strangled his own empire by creating enemies among former allies. The same audacity that conquered Europe led him to overextension that made defeat inevitable. Napoleon's legacy extends far beyond his military achievements. He established legal systems that still govern much of the world, spread nationalist ideas that reshaped European politics, and proved that individual merit could overcome aristocratic privilege. Modern concepts of equality before law, religious tolerance, and merit-based advancement trace directly to Napoleonic reforms that outlived his empire. The man who began as a mocked provincial teenager died as history's most studied military commander. His campaigns are analyzed in military academies worldwide. His tactical innovations remain relevant to modern warfare, and his personal story continues inspiring those who dare to challenge seemingly impossible odds. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered almost half the world because he dared to imagine what others thought impossible, possessed the genius to make dreams reality, and lived in an era when revolutionary change made extraordinary achievement possible. His ultimate defeat came not from lack of ability, but from the inevitable limits that constrain even the most exceptional individuals when they challenge the entire established order. The legend of the little corporal who became emperor reminds us that in the right circumstances, a single person can indeed change the course of human history.